Cynthia arrives during Imagine sessions. John Lennon's confession made her walk out in tears. It was September 1971, and the air inside Tittenhurst Park Studios carried the weight of something unfinished. John Lennon sat at the white grand piano in the main recording room, his fingers tracing the keys of a melody that would soon become immortal. The walls were painted stark white, reflecting the afternoon light that poured through the tall Georgian windows. Outside, the 72-acre estate stretched into the English countryside. But inside this room, time seemed suspended. Phil Spector stood in the control booth, his dark glasses hiding whatever thoughts moved behind his eyes. The tape machines rolled silently, capturing every breath, every hesitation, every moment of genius and doubt. John had been working on Imagine for weeks now, perfecting something that felt both impossibly simple and devastatingly profound. "Take 17, someone called out. John's hands found the first Mrs. Lennon, the woman who had loved him before the world knew his name. Her blonde hair was shorter now, more sophisticated than the art school girl he'd married in 1962. She wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried herself with a dignity that came from surviving what most people only read about in newspapers. John's fingers froze on the keys. The silence that followed was the kind that screams. "Hello, John," Cynthia said, her voice steady but carrying something underneath, something that sounded like courage mixed with fear. Phil Spector removed his headphones slowly, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. The session musicians, Klaus Vormann on bass, Alan White on drums, exchanged glances but said nothing. Everyone in that studio knew who Cynthia was. Everyone knew what her presence meant. John stood up from the piano bench, his movements careful, measured. He was wearing his signature round glasses and a denim shirt, his hair longer than it had been during the Beatles years. At 31, he looked both older and somehow more vulnerable than the cheeky Liverpudlian who'd conquered the world. "Sin," he said, and just that one syllable carried a decade of history. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she continued, stepping further into the studio. "I called ahead, but I don't think the message reached you. I needed to talk to you about Julian, about arrangements. Their son, Julian Lennon, 8 years old and caught between two worlds, two parents, two versions of what family meant. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. "We can talk in the other room," John said, gesturing toward the lounge area adjacent to the studio. But Cynthia didn't move. Her eyes had found the sheet music on the piano. The lyrics to Imagine were scrawled in John's handwriting, words that would soon ask the world to envision a place with no possessions, no greed, no hunger. She asked quietly. John's jaw tightened. "Yeah, still working on it." Cynthia walked closer to the piano, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. She read the lyrics, her lips moving slightly as she took in the words. "Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. It's beautiful," she said, and there was no sarcasm in her voice. Just a say. Cynthia arrives during Imagine sessions. John Lennon's confession made her walk out in tears. September 1971. Tittenhurst Park, Ascot, England. The air was thick with creative tension and something darker, something unspoken that hung in the corridors of John Lennon's Georgian mansion like morning fog refusing to lift. Inside the white room, the one they called the studio, John sat at the grand piano, his fingers dancing over ivory keys, searching for something he couldn't name. The Imagine sessions were in full swing. Phil Spector paced behind the mixing desk, his dark glasses hiding eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Yoko sat cross-legged on the floor, her presence both muse and fortress, watching John with the intensity of someone guarding a treasure they'd fought too hard to claim. Outside, beyond the manicured lawns and the peacocks that wandered the grounds, like ghosts of aristocratic pretension, a taxi pulled up the long gravel driveway. The sound of tires on stone cut through the September afternoon like a knife through silk. Nobody was expected. Nobody had been invited. But Cynthia Lennon had never been good at waiting for invitations to places that once belonged to her. She stepped out of the taxi, her blonde hair catching the fading sunlight, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. In her hand, she clutched a letter, Julian's letter, their son's words written in the careful handwriting of. The taxi driver asked if she wanted him to wait. Cynthia looked up at the mansion, at the windows that reflected nothing but sky, and said yes. Something told her this wouldn't take long. Inside the studio, John was singing. His voice, raw and vulnerable, filled the space with a longing that made grown men uncomfortable. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. The words floated through the air like prayers from a man who'd stopped believing in God, but desperately needed something to replace it. Nobody heard the doorbell, or maybe they did and chose to ignore it. But Cynthia Lennon had never been easy to ignore. She walked through the unlocked front door like a ghost returning to haunt the living, her footsteps silent on marble floors that had once echoed with different footsteps, different voices, a different life. The music drew her forward. John's voice, that voice she'd fallen in love with in art college when they were both young and stupid and thought love was enough. She followed it through corridors lined with avant-garde art that made no sense, past rooms filled with recording equipment that cost more than houses, until she stood in the doorway of the White Room, and there he was, John Winston Lennon, the man she'd married, the father of her child, the stranger who'd replaced the boy she'd known. He didn't see her at first. His eyes were closed, his body swaying slightly as he played, lost in whatever world the music was creating. But Yoko saw her. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Cynthia understood that this had been a mistake. Coming here, thinking she could reach him, believing that Julian's letter might matter more than whatever spell this place, this woman, this new life had cast over him. Phil Spector noticed her next. He stopped the tape, and the sudden silence was louder than the music had been. John's eyes opened. He turned, and when he saw Cynthia standing there, something flickered across his face. Surprise, guilt, annoyance. It was gone too quickly to name. Sin. His voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man greeting an unexpected bill collector. "What are you doing here?" The question hung in the air like smoke. What was she doing here? She was bringing their son's letter to a father who'd forgotten he had a son. She was trying to bridge a gap that had become an ocean. She was making one last desperate attempt to find the man she'd married somewhere inside this stranger who wore his face. But she said none of that. Instead, she held up the letter. "Julian wrote to you. You haven't answered. Again." John stared at the envelope in Cynthia's hand like it was a bomb that might explode if he touched it. The studio, which moments before had been filled with creative energy and the promise of something transcendent, now felt like a courtroom where he was both judge and accused. "I've been busy," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "We're in the middle of recording. You can't just show up here, Cyn. This is my workspace." Yoko stood up from her position on the floor, moving to John's side with the fluid grace of someone marking territory. She said nothing, but her presence spoke volumes. "This is my space now. These are my sessions. You don't belong here anymore." Cynthia felt the familiar sting of being erased, of being treated like a problem that should have been solved years ago. But she'd come too far to turn back now. Your son is 8 years old, John, 8, and he doesn't understand why his father won't talk to him, why you moved to this palace and forgot he exists. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she was tired. Tired of being diplomatic, tired of protecting John from the consequences of his choices, tired of explaining to Julian why Daddy was too busy changing the world to remember his birthday. Phil Spector cleared his throat, sensing the storm brewing. Maybe we should take a break, John. Give you two some privacy. But John shook his head, his jaw tightening in that way Cynthia remembered from 1,000 arguments. 1,000 nights when he'd chosen pride over peace. No. Whatever Cyn has to say, she can say it here. We don't have secrets, do we, Cyn? The cruelty of the question landed like a slap. They'd had nothing but secrets toward the end of their marriage. His affairs, her loneliness, the slow death of everything they'd built together, happening in silence while the world screamed Beatlemania outside their windows. Cynthia walked further into the room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a countdown to something inevitable. She placed Julian's letter on the piano, right on top of the sheet music for Imagine. "Read it," she said quietly. "Just read what your son has to say. That's all I'm asking." John looked at the letter like it might bite him. His hands, which moments ago had been creating beauty from ivory keys, now trembled slightly. He picked up the envelope, turned it over, studying Julian's careful handwriting on the front. Dad. Just that one word, written in blue crayon because Julian still thought crayon made things more special. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John opened the letter slowly, like a man defusing a bomb. The paper rustled in the silence of the studio, and everyone pretended not to watch as his eyes moved across his son's words. But Cynthia watched. She watched every micro-expression that crossed his face. The initial resistance, the softening around his eyes, the moment when something inside him cracked just a little. Julian had written about school, about a drawing he'd made that won a prize, about missing his dad, about wondering if maybe he'd done something wrong, something that made his father stop loving him. The letter ended with a question that gutted anyone with a heart. "Do you still remember me, Dad?" John's hands were shaking now, really shaking. He set the letter down on the piano and turned away, his back to everyone in the room. The silence stretched out like a living thing, uncomfortable and demanding. "He thinks I don't remember him." John's voice was barely a whisper, but in the acoustics of the white room, it carried. "My son thinks I've forgotten he exists." Yoko moved closer to him, her hand reaching for his arm, but John stepped away. For the first time since Cynthia had arrived, there was space between them. Physical space that felt like emotional continents shifting. "You have forgotten him," Cynthia said, and there was no anger in her voice now, just a terrible sadness that made the truth even harder to hear. Not completely, maybe, but enough that an 8-year-old boy goes to bed every night wondering what he did wrong, wondering why his father chose a new life over him. John spun around, and there were tears in his eyes, real tears, not the performative emotion he'd learned to display for cameras and journalists. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't hate myself every single day for what I've done?" The confession hung in the air like a ghost. Phil Spector quietly excused himself, suddenly very interested in checking equipment in another room. But Yoko stayed, her presence a reminder that whatever John was feeling, Whatever guilt was eating him alive, she was the future and Cynthia was the past. "Then change it," Cynthia said simply. "Stop hating yourself and start being his father. It's not complicated, John. He just wants to know you love him." John laughed, but it was a broken sound, sharp and painful. "Love. You want to talk to me about love? I'm writing an album about love, about imagining a world where love conquers everything. And you're standing here telling me I don't know how to love my own son." He picked up Julian's letter again, his fingers tracing the crayon letters. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm a fraud. Maybe everything I'm creating here is just pretty lies to cover up the ugly truth that I'm a terrible father and an even worse human being." The vulnerability in his voice was shocking. This wasn't the John Lennon the world knew. Not the sharp-tongued Beatle who'd told reporters that the band was bigger than Jesus. Not the peace activist who'd staged bed-ins and written, "Give peace a chance." This was the boy from Liverpool who'd lost his mother too young and never learned how to hold on to anything without crushing it. Cynthia felt her anger softening, but she fought against it. She'd forgiven John too many times before, made too many excuses for behavior that had no excuse. Julian needed her to be strong now, even if John needed her to be understanding. "I didn't come here for your self-pity, John. I came here because your son deserves better than a father who's too busy imagining a perfect world to notice the real one falling apart around him." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through the room. Yoko finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, the voice of someone who'd learned to navigate John's emotional storms. "Perhaps this conversation should happen in private. This is clearly a family matter." But Cynthia shook her head. "No, this is exactly where it needs to happen. In the middle of your Imagine sessions. In the middle of your perfect new life. Because maybe John needs to see what his imagination is costing the people who loved him first." John looked at Cynthia, really looked at her. And for a moment, she saw the boy she'd fallen in love with. The art student, with dreams bigger than his talent, and a heart that felt everything too deeply. "What do you want from me, Cyn? What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me the truth," Cynthia said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Not the truth you tell journalists, not the truth you sing in your songs. The real truth. Do you regret Julian? Do you wish he'd never been born so you could have this life without the guilt?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, sharp and terrible and impossible to ignore. John's face went pale, and for a moment Cynthia thought he might actually answer, might actually give voice to the fear that had haunted her since the day he'd left. That Julian had been a mistake, an anchor that had dragged John down when he wanted to fly. That their son was nothing more than a reminder of a life John had outgrown. But John didn't answer. Not right away. He walked to the window, looking out at the grounds of Tittenhurst Park, at the peacocks and the perfectly manicured lawns and the life he'd built with Yoko's help and Yoko's money and Yoko's vision of what John Lennon should be. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Cynthia had to strain to hear it. "I don't regret Julian. I regret that I'm not the father he deserves. There's a difference." Cynthia felt something inside her chest crack. Because she'd expected anger, expected defensiveness, expected John to blame her for bringing this confrontation into his sacred, creative space. But this quiet admission of failure was somehow worse than any argument would have been. "Then be the father he deserves," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not too late, John. He's 8 years old. He still believes in you. He still thinks you're a hero. But that window is closing. Every day you don't call, every letter you don't answer, every birthday you forget, that window closes a little more." John turned from the window, and there were tears streaming down his face now, unchecked and unashamed. "You want to know the truth, Cyn? The real truth? I'm terrified. I'm terrified that if I let Julian in, If I let myself be his father, I'll fail him the way my father failed me, the way my mother failed me by dying. I'm terrified that I'll love him and lose him, or worse, that I'll love him and damage him, and he'll spend the rest of his life in therapy trying to undo what I've done." The confession was raw and painful, and more honest than anything John had said to her in years. Yoko stood frozen by the piano, her face unreadable, but Cynthia could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. This vulnerability, this breakdown, was dangerous. It threatened the carefully constructed narrative of John's new life. It threatened the image of the enlightened artist who transcended his past. "So, instead you choose to damage him by absence?" Cynthia's voice was gentle now, not accusing but questioning. "You think ignoring him is somehow less harmful than being present and imperfect?" John wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so childlike that Cynthia's heart ached. "I don't know what I think anymore. I thought leaving was the right thing. I thought giving you both space, giving Julian a chance to grow up without my chaos, was the loving choice. But maybe I was just being a coward. Maybe I was just running away like I always do." Phil Spector had quietly returned to the room, sensing that whatever was happening had reached a critical point. He stood in the doorway, neither in nor out, a witness to something he probably wished he wasn't seeing. "John," Cynthia said, and she walked closer to him, close enough to see the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd met, close enough to smell the cigarettes and the expensive cologne that Yoko bought him. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be present. Julian doesn't need a hero. He needs a father. Even a flawed one." John looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the war happening inside him. The part that wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, to be the father Julian needed. And the part that was terrified of failing, of being vulnerable, of admitting that maybe the new life he built wasn't as perfect as he'd convinced himself it was. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I don't know how to be what he needs." Cynthia reached out and took his hand. And for a moment, they were just two people who'd loved each other once, who'd created a life together, who'd failed each other in ways both small and catastrophic. You start by answering his letters. You start by calling him. You start by showing up. That's all. Just show up, John. The rest will figure itself out. For a moment, Cynthia thought he might agree, might promise to do better, might finally choose Julian over his fear. But then Yoko spoke, her voice cutting through the moment like a knife through silk. "John has commitments. The album, the peace movement. We can't just drop everything because his son needs him?" Cynthia finished, her voice hardening. "That's exactly what you can do. That's exactly what you should do." The battle lines were drawn again. Cynthia could see John retreating, see him pulling back into the safety of his new life, his new priorities, his new identity as the man who was going to change the world. "I'll call him," John said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'll write back. I will. Just give me time to finish the album. Give me time to—" "Time," Cynthia interrupted, and now the anger was back, hot and righteous. "That's all you ever ask for. More time. But time isn't infinite, John. Julian is growing up. Every day you wait is a day you can't get back. Every missed birthday, every unanswered letter, every broken promise is another brick in the wall between you." John's face hardened, the vulnerability disappearing behind the armor he'd perfected over years of being John Lennon, untouchable icon. "Don't come into my home and tell me how to live my life, Cyn. You don't know what I'm dealing with. You don't know the pressure I'm under." And there it was, the deflection, the pivot from guilt to grievance, the transformation of victim into villain that John had mastered. Cynthia felt the familiar exhaustion wash over her, the bone-deep tiredness of fighting a battle she could never win. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know what you're dealing with, but I know what Julian is dealing with. I know what it's like to watch your son cry himself to sleep because his father doesn't love him enough to pick up the phone. I know what it's like to make excuses for you, to protect you, to lie to our son about why Daddy can't visit, why Daddy can't call, why Daddy is too busy saving the world to remember his birthday. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. John opened his mouth to respond, but Cynthia wasn't finished. You want to know what Julian told me last week? He said maybe if he was more interesting, you'd want to talk to him. An 8-year-old boy thinks he's not interesting enough for his own father. That's what your absence is teaching him, that he's not worth your time, that he's not enough. Something in John's face crumbled. The armor cracked, and underneath was just a man who'd made terrible choices and didn't know how to fix them. But she held up her hand, stopping him. I didn't come here for apologies. I came here because I needed to see if there was anything left of the man I married. The man who used to talk about wanting to be a better father than his own. The man who held Julian when he was born and cried because he was so happy. That man is gone, isn't he? Cynthia's voice broke on the last word. He died somewhere between Hamburg and Hollywood, and I've been mourning him for years while pretending he might come back. John's tears were flowing freely now, but Cynthia felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just a hollow emptiness where love used to live. I'm still here, John said desperately. I'm still that person. You're not, Cynthia interrupted, and her voice was gentle now. Almost kind, which somehow made it worse. And that's okay. People change. Lives change. But don't pretend you're the victim here, John. Don't pretend that choosing this life, this woman, this version of yourself was something that happened to you. You made a choice. You chose Yoko over Julian. You chose peace activism over being present for your son. You chose to imagine a better world instead of building one for the child you brought into this one. The truth of it landed like a bomb. Yoko's face went rigid, but she said nothing. Phil Spector looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. And John looked like a man watching his own execution. That's not fair, he whispered. Life isn't about choosing one thing over another. I can be a father and an artist. I can love Julian and love Yoko. Can you? Cynthia asked, and there was no malice in the question, just genuine curiosity. Because from where I'm standing, you've proven that you can't, or won't, and I'm not sure which is worse. She picked up Julian's letter from the piano, folding it carefully and putting it back in her purse. I'm going to tell Julian that I saw you, that you're working on important music, that you love him, but you're very busy. I'll keep lying for you, John, because that's what I do. I protect our son from the truth about his father. But this is the last time I'm coming here. The last time I'm begging you to be present in Julian's life. From now on, if you want a relationship with your son, you'll have to be the one to reach out. You'll have to be the one to make the effort, because I'm done being the bridge between you two. I'm done sacrificing my dignity to preserve his hope. Cynthia turned to leave, but John grabbed her arm. Wait, please, don't go like this. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. How should I go, John? Should I pretend this conversation didn't happen? Should I smile and say it was nice to see you? Should I wish you luck with your album about imagining a world with no possessions, while you live in a mansion and possess everything except the courage to be a father to your son? John dropped her arm like it had burned him. You're being cruel. I'm being honest, Cynthia corrected. Maybe for the first time in years, I'm being completely honest with you. And you can't handle it because you've surrounded yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear, who validate your choices, who make you feel like a hero for abandoning your responsibilities in pursuit of some greater purpose. She looked at Yoko, who met her gaze with cold defiance. You think you saved him. You think you gave him freedom and purpose and a chance to be his true self. But all you did was give him permission to run away from the hard parts of being human, the parts that require sacrifice and compromise, and showing up even when it's uncomfortable. Yoko finally spoke, her voice like ice. "You don't know anything about our relationship, about what John and I have built together." "You're right," Cynthia agreed. "I don't, but I know what it cost. I know that Julian paid the price for your great love story. And someday, when you're older and you look back on this, I hope you'll ask yourself if it was worth it. If the art you created together was worth a little boy's broken heart." Cynthia walked toward the door of the white room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a countdown to something final. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with years of disappointment and the death of hope she'd been carrying like a cross. Behind her, she could hear John breathing, ragged and uneven, the sound of a man drowning in his own choices. "Cyn, wait." His voice was desperate now, stripped of pretense. "Please, don't leave like this. Let me explain." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Explain what, John? Explain why your son isn't worth a phone call? Explain why you can spend hours in this studio creating songs about love and peace, but you can't spend 5 minutes writing back to an 8-year-old boy who thinks his father has forgotten him." The silence that followed was deafening. Cynthia could feel the weight of unspoken words, of excuses that even John knew wouldn't hold water, of justifications that crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. When she finally turned around, John was sitting at the piano, his head in his hands, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. The great John Lennon, reduced to a man who couldn't face his own failures. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was so broken that for a moment Cynthia almost went to him, almost offered comfort, almost fell back into the old pattern of protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not anymore. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," she said quietly. "Sorry doesn't give Julian back the years you've missed. Sorry doesn't undo the damage of making a child feel unwanted by his own father." She paused, gathering the courage for what she needed to say next. "I loved you, John. God help me. I loved you so much that I lost myself trying to be what you needed. But I can't love you more than I love our son. And Julian needs me to be strong enough to walk away from you, to stop making excuses, to stop hoping you'll change." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. "So this is me, walking away, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in acceptance. Acceptance that you're not going to be the father Julian needs. Acceptance that I can't force you to be someone you're not. Acceptance that sometimes love isn't enough." John looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw everything they'd been and everything they'd never be. "I do love him. I love Julian more than I know how to say." "Then show him," Cynthia said simply. "Love isn't something you feel, John. It's something you do. It's showing up. It's being present. It's choosing your child over your comfort, over your art, over your new life. But you won't do that. You can't, and I've finally accepted that." She took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her chest. A weight lifting, a door closing, an ending that was somehow also a beginning. "Goodbye, John. I hope your album changes the world. I hope you imagine a better future and somehow make it real. But I hope even more that someday you'll realize what you gave up to get there." Cynthia walked out of the white room, through the corridors lined with expensive art, past the rooms filled with equipment that cost more than most people made in a year, out into the September afternoon that suddenly felt lighter, clearer, easier to breathe. The taxi was still waiting. The driver looked up as she approached, his face questioning. "Everything okay, miss?" Cynthia climbed into the back seat and looked back at Tittenhurst Park one last time. At the mansion where John was creating his masterpiece. At the windows that reflected nothing but sky. At the life she'd once been part of and would never be part of again. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "Everything is going to be okay." As the taxi pulled away, Cynthia didn't look back. She'd spent too many years looking back, wondering what she could have done differently, how she could have saved a marriage that was doomed from the start. Now, she was looking forward to Julian, to the life they would build together, to the future that didn't include John Lennon, except as a name on a birth certificate and a voice on the radio. Inside the studio, John sat at the piano, Julian's letter in his hands, the weight of everything he'd lost finally settling on his shoulders like a stone. Yoko stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, but for the first time since they'd been together, her presence wasn't enough. "We should get back to work," she said gently. "The album won't finish itself." But John didn't move. He stared at his son's handwriting, at the crayon letters that spelled out Dad, at the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Do you still remember me?" Phil Spector cleared his throat. "John, whenever you're ready, we can pick up where we left off." But John shook his head. "I can't. Not today. Maybe not ever." He stood up from the piano, Julian's letter still clutched in his hand, and walked out of the white room, walked out of the session. Walked away from Imagine and everything it represented, because Cynthia had been right about one thing. He'd been imagining a better world while destroying the real one, and no amount of beautiful music could change that truth. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence from Tittenhurst Park. 3 days of John Lennon not recording, not creating, not being the artist the world expected him to be. Yoko was worried. Phil Spector was frustrated. The studio sat empty. The white room that had been filled with music, now filled with nothing but the echo of words that couldn't be unsaid. John spent those 3 days in his bedroom, Julian's letter on the nightstand, a phone beside it that he picked up and put down 100 times without ever dialing. On the 4th day, a package arrived at Cynthia's flat in London. No return address, no note, just a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a cassette tape. No label, no explanation. Just a tape that Cynthia held in her hands like it might explode. She waited until Julian was asleep before she played it. Sat in her small living room, so different from the mansion in Ascot, and pressed play. John's voice filled the room. Not singing, just talking. Talking to Julian. Talking to himself. Talking to the ghost of the father he'd wanted to be, and the reality of the father he'd become. "Jules," the recording began, and Cynthia's breath caught because John hadn't called their son Jules in years. "I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I don't know if your mom will even play it for you, but I need to say these things, even if you never hear them." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of John breathing, gathering courage. "Your mom came to see me a few days ago. She brought your letter, the one where you asked if I still remember you. And Jules, that question broke something inside me that I didn't know could break." Another pause. The sound of John crying, trying to compose himself. "I remember everything about you. I remember the day you were born, how small you were, how perfect. I remember your first word, your first step, the way you used to fall asleep on my chest when you were a baby. I remember teaching you to draw, the way you'd stick your tongue out when you concentrated. I remember all of it, Jules. Every single moment." Cynthia was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she listened to John finally say the things he should have said years ago. But remembering isn't enough, is it? Your mom was right about that. Love isn't something you feel. It's something you do, and I haven't been doing it. I've been hiding behind my work, behind my new life, behind my fear of failing you, the way I was failed. The tape continued, John's voice raw and honest, in a way his music had never been. "I'm scared, Jules. I'm scared that if I let you in, if I let myself be your father, I'll mess it up. I'll say the wrong things, do the wrong things. I'll hurt you the way I've been hurt. And I thought staying away was protecting you from that. But your mom made me see that staying away is just another way of hurting you. Maybe the worst way. There was the sound of John lighting a cigarette, inhaling, exhaling. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the father you deserve, but I want to try, if you'll let me. If your mom will let me. I want to try to be present, to show up, to be more than just a name and a voice on the radio." The tape ended with John saying, "I love you, Jules. I know I haven't shown it. I know I haven't earned the right to say it. But I love you, and I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry." Cynthia sat in the silence after the tape ended, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. It wasn't enough. A tape wasn't enough. Words weren't enough. But it was a start. It was John finally admitting the truth, finally being vulnerable, finally choosing honesty over image. She didn't play the tape for Julian. Not yet. He was too young to understand the complexity of what his father was saying. Too young to carry the weight of John's guilt and fear and desperate hope for redemption. But she kept it, saved it for a day when Julian would be old enough to hear it and understand that his father had loved him, even if he hadn't known how to show it. The Imagine album was released 2 months later. It became John's most successful solo work, a masterpiece that critics called transcendent, revolutionary, a glimpse into a better world. But John never finished the sessions the way he'd planned. The album was different after Cynthia's visit, darker in places, more honest, less about imagining a perfect world, and more about accepting an imperfect one. In interviews, John talked about the album with pride, but also with something else. A sadness that people couldn't quite name. A sense that the cost of creating it had been higher than anyone knew. He never talked about Cynthia's visit, never mentioned the confrontation in the White Room, never explained why the sessions had stopped for 4 days or what had changed in him during that time. But people close to him noticed the difference. The way he'd go quiet sometimes, lost in thought. The way he'd pick up the phone and put it down without calling. The way he'd stare at nothing, seeing something no one else could see. Cynthia and John never reconciled, never became friends, never found a way back to each other. But something shifted after that day in September. John started calling Julian, not often, not as much as he should have, but more than before. He started showing up for birthdays, started sending letters, started trying, in his imperfect, inconsistent way, to be present in his son's life. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo the years of absence, the damage of making Julian feel unwanted. But it was something. And sometimes, something is all we can give. Years later, after John was gone, Julian would find the tape, would listen to his father's voice, raw and broken and honest, admitting his failures and his fears, would hear the love underneath the pain, the desperate hope for redemption that John had carried until the end. And Julian would understand, finally, that his father had loved him, had always loved him. But that love, without action, without presence, without the courage to show up, had been a ghost. Beautiful and tragic, and ultimately not enough. The story of that September day in 1971 became a footnote in John Lennon's biography, a small moment in a life filled with larger moments. But for Cynthia, for Julian, for everyone who'd been in that white room when truth finally broke through the carefully constructed image, it was the moment everything changed. The moment when the man behind the legend was finally forced to look at himself and see not a revolutionary, not an artist, not a visionary, but just a father who'd failed his son. And in that failure, in that moment of brutal honesty, John Lennon became more human than he'd ever been on stage or in a recording studio. Not a villain, just a man who'd made terrible choices and had to live with them. Just a father who'd loved his son but hadn't known how to show it. Just a human being, flawed and broken and desperately trying to imagine a better version of himself. While the real world, the one with consequences and responsibilities, and a little boy who needed him fell apart around him. That's the truth they don't put in the history books. That's the story behind Imagine. That's what happened when Cynthia Lennon walked into that white room and forced John to see himself clearly for the first time in years. And sometimes, the truth is more powerful than any song, more lasting than any album, more important than any legacy. Sometimes, the truth is just a woman walking out in tears, a man sitting at a piano with his son's letter in his hands, and the silence that speaks louder than any music ever could.